Roughly the first half of this course is going to be dedicated to risk assessment and some of the mathematics that you'll need to think quantitatively about risks. Risk is the chance of something bad happening, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it for a few reasons. The first is that thinking quantitatively about probabilities and risks will be useful in all sorts of applications, so it's good practice. The second is that it's an extremely important piece of environmental regulation, so it's useful to have some familiarity with it. Finally, we humans are really bad at thinking about risk, and hopefully applying some rigor to the issue will improve some of your risk-related decisions. Let's think a little bit about that last one. I say that we're bad at thinking about risk because we don't usually do what economists think we should, which is find a way to maximize our general well-being while reducing our chance of bad outcomes in some coherent way. The problem is that risk is tied up with fear, and fear gets in the way of us making thoughtful decisions. Moreover, we don't like to think about death very much, so we tend to find ways to ignore everyday risks so that we're not always remembering that one wrong move could spell our end. An example I like to give here happened when we were living in California many years ago. Back in 1994, there were two separate fatal mountain lion attacks in the state, which is so unusual that there's only been one more in the entire quarter century since that. Anyway, these were in two distant counties in the state. One was in the far south and one was in the central mountain region. We'd been planning to go camping in the Desolation Wilderness in a few weeks, and my wife announced that we were going to have to cancel. When I asked why, she looked at me as if I was crazy and said, "There are mountain lions out there. Killing people is why." That seemed logical. Who wants to get mauled by a mountain lion? Not me, that's for sure. But when you think about it, that was a fairly irrational worry on our part. Some 100 million people visit state and national parks every year in California, so a very rough guess would be that our chance of getting killed by a mountain lion was something on the order of 2 in 100 million. Of course, we'd be camping, so that probably would increase our risk, although neither of the fatalities had been campers, but we're probably talking about risks on the order of something like 1 in 10 million or so. At the same time, the Desolation Wilderness would have been a 4-hour one-way trip for us, meaning that we'd be driving a total of about 450 miles there and back. Highway statistics are that we see roughly one fatality for every 200 million miles driven or so. That means the car trip had a risk of death of something like 1 in 500,000. In other words, we are something like 20 times more likely to die from the drive than from a mountain lion attack, but we had been fine with the driving part of it. Nobody ever cancels a trip and says, as if it should be obvious, "Do you really want to take your life into your own hands with that kind of risk?" I mean, we'd be driving, for crying out loud. So what's the difference? Well, a few things are going on here. One is that we've driven a lot, and so far so good, so it feels like a relatively safe activity even though statistics say it isn't. But the mountain lion attacks were newly relevant, and so it felt like that had changed. When we learn of new dangers, we feel like we ought to take them into account, and if you weigh the risk of death versus the joy of a camping trip, it seems frivolous to go camping when mountain lions are out and about. Part of this is because we don't have any sense of what a 1 in 10 million or 1 in 500,000 chance of death is, and so we look for shortcuts. The shortcut we come up with is, quote, "I'm hearing about mountain lion attacks, so it must be dangerous," unquote, while at the same time driving feels like a fairly safe activity because we do it all the time. Also, there's the question of control. We tend to try very hard to avoid dangerous situations that we can't control, but we're more comfortable in dangerous situations that we can control, at least in theory. Now that's silly. Many of the 35,000 people in the US who die every year are much better drivers than I am, and being in control didn't help them. So what do I think I'm really going to do? But it does make me feel less afraid of the risk. Thinking of risk quantitatively can be important when thinking about public policy because it's impossible to eliminate all risk from life. We will all eventually die of something, and nearly all activities involve some risk, even if that risk is small. So we can't regulate away all risk. Thus, we want to make sure that we focus limited resources on the most problematic issues. What we find if we don't use some kind of quantitative risk assessment is that we may wind up regulating against the quote danger of the week unquote, where some chemical gets news coverage not because it's particularly dangerous, but because our understanding of the chemical's risk has changed and that was newsworthy. Then people hear about it and get concerned, saying they don't want that in their food, and we ban it, even though banning it may not save many lives at all. Meanwhile, there may be plenty of chemicals out there that we are used to because they're part of our daily lives that are more dangerous and actually should be regulated, but because we're used to them, we're not afraid of them. Back in the late 90s, Kip Viscusi and some others studied the comparative costs of various life-saving regulations and found that some, like enforcing the employee formaldehyde exposure limits, appeared to cost several $100 billion for every life saved, while others, like reducing trihalomethane in drinking water, cost well under $1 million per life saved. Maybe we could do better to reduce regulations on formaldehyde and strengthen up the drinking water standards, people figured. But you'd never get this information without quantifying risk fairly carefully. Both formaldehyde and trihalomethane will kill you, so it's no surprise that we want to limit them. Maybe more importantly, in the US, the greatest threat to health is, in many ways, poverty. A recent study found that the poorest 1% of 40-year-old men in the US should expect to live about 15 years less than the richest 1%, and for women the difference was about 10 years. That's pretty horrifying. It means that extreme poverty creates an annual risk of death of something like 2 in 100, which is ridiculous. Not even smoking will kill you with that kind of efficiency. Now, there are all kinds of caveats that we could put here. You get somewhat different results if you control different variables. It might make sense to compare the bottom 10% against those with the median income to get a better sense of risk from falling into poverty, and so on. But the numbers don't change the basic message, which is that poverty is pretty much the most dangerous thing in the United States. What this means for us is that we would be doing nobody any favors if we regulated a toxin, but in doing so we damaged the economy to such an extent that it drove people out of work and into poverty. We would likely be increasing their risk. And this isn't entirely hypothetical. Imagine, for example, a carbon tax that led to a 20% increase in the cost of gasoline. There are certainly people living on the edge for whom this would make the cost of car ownership too high, especially if they also had to pay increased heating and food costs, for example. But that might mean that they could not get to work reliably at all, and many might lose their jobs and then fall into the poverty cycle. We all know that climate change is an environmental justice issue and that we want to address it at least in part because of the risk that it places on the most vulnerable among us. But if addressing it drives people out of work, then it may wind up being a net increase in risk, not a decrease, and our desire to help may end up hurting people. This is not to say that regulating environmental toxins is a bad idea. That depends upon a ton of other variables. For example, the most popular carbon tax proposal on the table actually reduces poverty by distributing the receipts from the tax, so it might be a large win from a risk perspective. But the point is that details wind up being incredibly important. So that's why we're going to spend the next few weeks thinking about how we quantify risk and how that plays out in policy and regulation.